Hi friends, so in this video I'm going to go over introducing our next 3 lenses as well as tips and tricks on how to read and analyze poetry as we are starting our poetry unit this week. So a lot of this is review already. We went over these slides back at the beginning of the semester when we learned about our first 3 lenses of study. So I'm going to scroll down to our next 3 lenses of study. So these lenses are honestly easier than the first 3. One you've already been doing in your book club groups, which is reader response. If you have been the responder, then this is that lens. The next is biographical, which is very similar to historical. However, it's focusing more on the writer's biography and their personal experiences rather than just the time period in which they wrote. And then formalism is something that you've already been doing as an English student, which is where we focus on form, symbols, images, literary devices, and things like that. So you can read these more descriptions if you want, but I'm just going to kind of go through each one through the key questions. So for reader response, it's what it sounds like. This is where you are, yourself. It's focusing on you, the reader, and what's going on in your mind rather than just focusing on the text or the author. So things that you want to be thinking about is how does the meaning of the text change as you read it? I think we've all read a piece of literature and we thought one thing going into it, and by the end of it we think something else, or even on the second or third read it changes, especially poetry. This is definitely very important in poetry. How do your values alter your perceptions of the text? Sometimes we react positively, negatively to the text based off of our own experiences, and that's okay. So what do you believe in, and does the text believe something different, or does the author or the poet believe something different, and how does that impact your analysis? How have readers in different time periods or different ages interpreted the text? So as with values change with each time period. So think about that as well. Like when the text was written versus when you read it now, that might have a different impact on the interpretation of the text. How is the informed reader's response to the text shaped by the reader and the text? So how does... Sorry, I have to remember how this one works. So how does your response change by the from reader to reader and the text itself? Which of your personal experiences or memories is affecting your perception of the story? I think we've all had this moment where we read, especially again, a poetry, or we listen to a song, or we read a novel, or anything like that, where it triggers something in you. And I don't mean trigger in like the, triggered way. I mean trigger like as in the sense that like, I remember when I had this moment in my life and this is how I feel about it. And that's important because especially with poetry is so emotion centric and focusing on memory often. You'll see one poet in particular that we read is definitely very fascinated with the concept of memory. And so that is intended often by the poets to make you feel something, and memories are linked to our emotions. And then what was the work's original intended audience, and to what extent are you similar or different from that audience? So is the poem originally written for a female audience in the 1800s? And how do you relate to that? Are you a member of the female audience? None of us were alive in the 1800s, even me. I even wasn't alive in the 1800s. So again, like obviously I'm different from that, but can I connect to the text, and how so? These are not the only questions for reader response, but these are some key questions to help you think about your personal connection to the text. Next, we have biographical. This one's easy. This is very similar to historical lens, but again, focusing on the actual author's background. In the case of poetry, the poet's background. So what aspects of the author's personal life are relevant to the story? This requires you to know a little bit of background about your poet, so you might have to do some research. Which of the author's stated beliefs are reflected in the work? Does the writer challenge or reflect the values of their contemporaries? Again, this is kind of historical. What seems to be the author's major concerns? Do they reflect any of the writer's personal experiences? Do any of the events in the story correspond to events experienced by the author? And do any of the characters in the story correspond to real people? Now, in the sake of poetry, what we need to know is with poetry, we have a poet, the author, but we also have a speaker. And sometimes they are one and the same. Sometimes the poet is the speaker, but that's not always the case. So we have to remember that. But, you know, in the event where we can draw parallels between the poet's background and the subject or the events in the poem, then yes, you can apply that biographical lens, even if technically the poet is not the speaker. Now, key questions, formalism. Again, you've already done this one before, especially if you've read poetry before. So we look at the work's structure in the next slide deck. In a second, I'm going to show you has tips on how to look at structure. But what is the work's structure? What reoccurring patterns do we see? And looking at patterns, you're also looking at structure. What is the effect of these patterns or these motifs? So an example of a pattern or a motif that we're seeing in Oedipus Rex right now is the idea of like sight and blindness, right? There's that big fight between Tiresias and Oedipus Rex where Tiresias is like, I might be the blind one, but you're blind to your own past, right? And that kind of idea of blindness and knowledge and sight being interlinked is something that's an important motif in the play, which also connects to one of the major themes of the play. So we want to be looking like in poetry, do we see any patterns or do we see any motifs in the text, and does that connect to the theme? How does repetition reinforce the themes of the poem? How does the writer's diction, which is word choice, reveal or reflect the work's meaning? Now with diction, it's important to know that we also have connotation and denotation. I don't know if I can write on this because this is a presentation. Probably should have put this in Notability. Oh well, okay. But anyway, we have connotation and denotation, and I believe these were vocab words already. But with diction, denotation is the dictionary definition of a word, and then connotation is the word or idea, is the word or the emotion, or idea that the word evokes. So, for example, if you have house and home, right? They both have the same denotation dictionary definition. House and home are both like a dwelling place. However, the home has the stronger connotation behind it because you probably start to get like sight, sound, and smell of your own home in the word home, right? So real estate agents, they don't sell houses, they sell homes. They sell the experience, right? Same thing with like butcher and like slaughterhouse, right? Same denotation, but the slaughterhouse, I think we can all agree, has a very strong, like kind of gross connotation, right? Butcher, yeah, we know what the butcher does. Slaughterhouse, man, you can like hear the poor animals being murdered, right? In the slaughterhouse, they're being slaughtered. Okay, so again, a stronger connotation. So when we read poetry, word choice, because there's such little words in poetry, word choice, diction is so essential in understanding the choices that the poet makes. If there is a plot, which poems can have plot, if there is a plot, what is the effect of the plot and what parts specifically produce that effect? What figures of speech are used? So metaphors, simile, hyperbole, personification, etc. Obviously in poetry, we always identify these things, but now we want to start thinking, how do they help with the theme? What is the effect of the figurative language? How does the writer's use of paradox, irony, symbol, plot, characterization, and style enhance the story? What effects are produced, and do any of these relate to one another or to the theme? Obviously, in a novel, this is really important, and in a play, in a poem, these things can still be there as well. Is there a relationship between the beginning and the end of the story? And then, obviously, with poetry, tone and mood are really, really important. So what tone and mood are created at various parts of the poem or of the work? And how does the author do this? And what is the relationship? Because tone and mood are not always the same thing, right? For example, if we're reading a satirical piece, the mood might be, the tone might be like lighthearted, not lighthearted, but it might be like comical, but the mood, depending on how you feel, might be like invigorating. It might also be like guilty, because especially if the thing that's being satirized is something that you are guilty of. So sometimes they aren't always overlapping in the same. And then, how do various elements of the work reinforce the meaning, and how do the various elements interact to create a unified whole? So just how does it all work together to help with your understanding, and how does it all work together to show the author's like choices? So again, formalism we've already been doing as English students. All right, so now this is going to be, believe it or not, the longer of the two presentations. Hopefully it doesn't take forever. I'm not even going to present it. This is how to read and annotate poetry. And I put this together. It was adapted from a couple resources that I found. So how to read and annotate poetry. So 10 rules, quote unquote, rules for reading poetry. Poems are meant to be read out loud. So you have to read them out loud. Poems are not meant to be read in quiet. Okay, there is so much, and this is where formalism comes in, there are so much sound devices and choices that affect sound, that affect rhythm and meter and rhyme, that you have to read it out loud to really hear the poems. So you need to read out loud. We're also going to be talking about shifts and where shifts happen. In the text, shifts are so important. If you are wanting to do well on the FRQs that you're going to be doing next year for the AP test, where you have to read and analyze a poem, looking at shifts is really, really intentional analysis. Reading poetry like prose. So prose is like not poetry, right? So we need to start reading poems like they're novels. So break them down. Literal versus figurative meaning of words, again, and of what's happening. Sometimes if there's plot, there's a literal plot, and then there's a figurative plot, or same thing with the words. Breaking down figurative language, and I think number 5 is something that I see a lot of people do at the beginning. We're always like, oh, that's alliteration. Oh, that's a metaphor. Oh, that's a simile. That's great. I'm glad you can find those things. That's step 1. Now we need to actually analyze them. How do they affect our understanding? How do they affect the way the poem sounds? How do they affect the meaning of the poem and our interpretation of it? We really, 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 really need to start analyzing the devices, not just identifying the devices. The title of poems, when titled, don't skip those. They're normally important. So analyze the title. Poems are short. Read them again. Read them again. Read them again. Every time you read a poem, I'm sure you will find something new. I do. And I've read a lot of these poems so many times. This probably bothers especially my math and science people. There's not always one right answer. Okay? You have to support it though. And then again, denotative and connotative meaning of words. We talked about this in our last presentation. And then annotate. You have to annotate poetry. They're not long, so you have to annotate them. So those are some rules for reading poetry. Now here are some strategies. So you don't have to do all of these. These are just, if you are someone who's like, I don't know how to begin with a poem, poetry's never been my thing, here are some little tips. So 1, 2, 3 for initial understanding. So in your first reading, just read it once through to get an idea of what the poem's about. Sometimes, and I actually do this 1, 2, 3 thing, except for I do like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 into infinity. But my first time I read a poem, I don't touch it. I just read it out loud. I want to get an idea of what's happening. I want to get an initial interpretation. I want to hear it. So just read it once through to get an idea of what's happening. On this second reading is where I start to annotate and see what stands out to me about the poem. This is where I can start to identify like the shift or figurative language or the structure or things like that. And then in your third infinity reading, this is where we start to really like break down what we're finding and what stands out as important, what the author or the poet uses to create meaning. And this is where we really get into our analysis. And so I say third infinity because you might have to do this more than 3 times. Now, same thing, 1, 2, 3 for analysis. So if you wanted to get started annotating right away, maybe the first read, you do your initial like annotations for meaning, like what's happening, is there a story, what's kind of going on. Then in your second reading, you can annotate for devices, where you start to identify devices, analyze devices, look at the form, look at the structure. And then on your third reading is where you start to figure out the theme. What is the message of the poem? And how does it all work together? Another strategy is something called four corners. So this is where, like, if you have your sheet of paper, or in your case, like your Notability iPad screen, you can do four corners, different annotations in the four corners. So on the upper left-hand corner, you can do like the big, so what stands out in this poem and why? In the upper right-hand corner, you can look at figurative language. So what figurative language do you notice? How does it expand the meaning of what is literally happening? Bottom left corner, you can look at the shifts. Where is the shift? Are there multiple shifts? What is the poem shifting from and to? And then the bottom right-hand corner, what questions do you have? So this is, again, another strategy. Now, this one's really good for reader response lens. So this is looking at head, heart, and gut, which is your tummy. So annotate your responses to the poem using the following questions. So head, what from the poem makes you think? Right? What ideas do you get from the poem, and where do you see those ideas? Heart, how does the poem make you feel when reading the poem? Does it trigger any memories? Does it trigger any emotions? How do you personally connect with it? How are your values associated with the poem? And then gut, what sticks out to you? What long-lasting impression is there? What resonates with you? Oftentimes, these two things together help you figure out the theme. And then this always should do, because it's part of your biographical lens and your historical lens application. You need to know who the poet is, their background, the time period, when is it set, etc. So combine your understanding of your historical lens and your biographical lens, identify moments in the poem where you see the background information apply, and consider the poet's tone throughout the poem. Does it connect with what you know their belief systems are, or their values, or their own personal experiences? Now, the rest of this pretty much is focusing on structure, because I think this is you always look at structure in any text, but I think with poetry in especially is structure. Because again, they're so short often. Obviously, you have these big epic poems, but most of the poems that we read are really short. So looking at structure is going to help your analysis so much. So this is where we start to really focus on the formalist lens. So why is structure important? Structure provides the framework for the events and details of the story to unfold. If your poem tells a story, which most poems tell stories, even if it doesn't feel like it's telling a story, it's still telling a story. So this framework affects the way a reader makes meaning of the text. Structure and analyzing structure and reading really offers a way into the text. So understanding structure can help us make meaning of the poem or the text. And like I said, it really requires higher level thinking skills. And this is very, very difficult in literary analysis, but this is also what we're looking for. This is what the AP readers look for. This is what many of the AP test multiple choice questions for poetry are asking about. So structure is so important. So there are four structure emphasis. So the first one's grouping of words, and I'm going to go through these more in a second. Then it's looking at shifts and contrasts. And then third is patterns and breaking of patterns. And then white space. And when I say patterns and breaking of patterns, I'm really going to look at rhyme and rhythm. However, as we discussed with the formalist lens, you can also look at like thematic patterns and repeating symbols and things like that. So grouping of words. So the first one, enjambment might be a new term for you. I can't remember if this was on one of your vocab lists, but enjambment is when we have incomplete syntax at the end of a line, and therefore the meaning runs over or steps over from one poetic line to the next without punctuation. So if we look at the poem on the right, you can see a perfect example of enjambment. Now, if I had broken up the sentences or the words and I had asked you to like put these together, you probably would have put we real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, like as individual lines. But as you can see here, the poem has enjambment. So instead it's we real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight. So it changes the way you read it. So that's really, really important and obviously incredibly intentional from the poet. Same thing if we look at stanzas. So a stanza is a group of lines. I think of it as like a paragraph, right, in prose. But in poetry, we say stanzas. So consider, when you're looking at the stanzas, consider how the poet groups the lines and the effect of the understanding. For example, here, right, we do have 4 specific stanzas, and so we want to be wondering, why are they grouped the way they are? Like, what was the intent behind the grouping of the stanzas? Also look at the progression of ideas from stanza to stanza, or even possible shifts from stanza to stanza. So that's one of the first sections of structure. Now, I keep saying the word shift, and you're like, what the heck is a shift? Because you've never learned this, right? Shifts are what they sound like. It's when there's a change in tone, when there's a change in ideas, that's a shift. So longer poems, you'll see this. Shorter poems, you sometimes see this. So we want to look for the shifts in poems. It really, really helps us with our interpretation, and really helps us look at contrasts and contrasting ideas. So things we want to be asking ourselves are, what are some striking contrasts in the poem? How do we identify the contrast shifts and juxtaposition in the poem, which is also a device? Do we see a contrast, and does that indicate a conflict of values? What ideas, traits, or values are emphasized in a contrast? How does a contrast contribute to the complexity of the poem? And I'm going to show you an example down here where we can kind of look at the shifts. And then how does a contrast contribute to the meaning of the poem and the purpose of the poem? Okay. Actually, let's go ahead and just look down here really quick. So in a second, we'll look at this poem also from looking at the white space. But if we read this poem really quick, this is called Playground Elegy by Clint Smith, who is a phenomenal contemporary poet. Phenomenal. Like, I fangirl over Clint Smith. I follow him on Instagram. But anyway, so Playground Elegy. So the first time I slid down a slide with my mother told me to hold my hands toward the sky. Something about gravity, weight distribution, and feeling the air ripple through your fingers. I reached the bottom, smile consuming half of my face, hand still in the air because I didn't want it to stop. Ever since, this defiance of gravity has always been synonymous with feeling alive. When I read of the new child, his body strewn across the street, a casket of bones and concrete, I wonder how many times he slid down the slide, how many times he defied gravity to answer a question in class. Did he raise hands for all of them? Does my mother regret this? She raised a black boy growing up to think that raised hands made me feel more alive. That raised hands meant I was alive. That raised hands meant that I would live. Oh, God, so good. So we see shifts here, right? The first section is youth, little boy going down the slide. The next shift is ever since this defiance of gravity, right? Now we have this new concept of feeling alive. Then we have down here the concept of raising your hand, right? Defying gravity, raising your hand in class and feeling empowered. And then we have at the very bottom the concept of raising hands for the police, right? And hopefully, as a young black man, not being shot, right? So we see shifts in here and how the concept of raising hands changes, right? It goes from we going down the slide to raising your hand in class of empowerment to raising your hand so you're not shot, right? So we see shifts in this poem, and that would be such good analysis, right? How does that contribute to the meaning, the intent behind the poem, things like that, and even the idea of like a little boy's body being strewn across the street, a casket of bones and concrete, right? How does that help connect to it? So anyway, obviously I want to analyze this poem, but that's not the point of this presentation. So that's shifts. Now, patterns and breaking of patterns, rhyme and rhythm. Rhythm and rhyme often provide a variety of set structure, which is great for easy identification. The hard work, however, is using the structure that you identify to aid in your interpretation and to aid in your analysis. So same thing. I can see that these lines rhyme. Now why? Why did the author rhyme those lines, right? It's also, connected to the sound of the poem, right? So formalist lens. So pay attention to her rhymed words or rhymes lines. What might the connection show us? Are there similarities? Are there contrasts? What might a shift, we're back to shifts, a shift in rhyme mean? Okay. Rhythm. Rhythm allows us to wonder about the formality or set of the format of a poem. So obviously a lot of people are good at, hearing the sounds of poems, but then we also need to think about what devices does the poet use to affect the sound and the rhythm, right? How does listing down here, how does the rhythm change as we read this text, right? So the first few lines, going back to this poem, the sound, the rhythm is very free and flowing, which is very similar to a young boy and the excitement and the freedom of going down a slide, versus as it goes down, there's a lot more shorter sentences. It's a lot more stuck together, which feels a lot more rigid, right? Even the questions that are in there, the rhetorical questions, affect the way the rhythm of the poem is, the hard sentences. So we want to be thinking about that as well. Like, look for those devices that affect the sound of the text. Sometimes poems don't have rhythm or rhyme. I mean, they always have rhythm. They don't have a set rhythm. Maybe they don't have iambic pentameter or things like that. There's still rhythm there. It's still intentional. So consider how else meaning is established and what the effect of that absence of rhyme affects how you read the poem. Now, last but not least is white space for structure. Same poem. Think about how it's laid out on the page. This one's a nice one for looking at this, like the way that this poem is meant to be published. It's a slide, right? It's a slide, so it connects back to that idea. Now, looking at white space is a very modern element to consider because poems are often typed and published in a very specific way. It's still really cool to look at, okay? So definitely still look at that. So that's structure. So last couple slides is just kind of big ideas. So key ideas in the big 7. So again, key elements in structure: stanzas, line breaks, rhyme, rhythm, punctuation, white space. Here are some questions to help guide you if when you're annotating you want some help on how to really get into that. More questions to consider for bigger structure. I would say personally, if I was reading a poem and I'm wanting help on structure, I might even have this slide open as I'm annotating the poem and try to see if I can answer those questions in my annotations. The big 7 is great. Obviously you should know all your devices. These big 7 literary elements are so good for poetry: tone, diction, word choice, connotation, denotation, syntax, the structure of the sentences themselves, imagery, characterization, conflict, and figurative language, metaphors, simile, things like that. These are your big 7, okay? I'm not saying don't look at all those other things, right? But these are a good big 7 to get comfortable with. So again, just a general overview, you have access to these presentations. When we get into actually starting to read and annotate the poems at the beginning of each assignment, I will have these 2 presentations linked, so you can always open these and have them side by side as you're reading the poems. Both this one and the literary theory one. I would probably end up focusing more on this one because I incorporated biographical, reader response, and formalist into this presentation. So here you go. I hope this helps. We will be doing some of the poems together. I think you're going to be great. Okay, see you later, guys.